look at another malt distillery than a grain distillery.
So with that sort of said, then we'll move on to Tomintown, because that's the distillery that I kind of know more about. So in a few sort of words, sentences, just describe how you would tell people about Tomintown, please.
Yeah, so Tomintown is kind of creamy, nutty, and sweet is my kind of three go-tos. And I don't mean that in a bland sense. I just think it's a very approachable whiskey, but it's got a bit of diversity to it as well. So it's very much a spirit of its era. So it was built in the 60s. It's a distillery that was built to kind of supply a modern market, I suppose. And it's in this beautiful surrounding, but it's a 1960s building. So some people I think it's got this kind of contrast of people thinking it looks a bit ugly, but I think as a kind of whiskey geek, I think it's really cool because it's very much of its time. So it's a kind of sweet, smooth, creamy Speyside, but I mean that in an endearing sense rather than a generic sense, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, what gets me is, I mean, where you say some people will think it's ugly. When I visited, and I've been twice now, so the first time I went was 3 years ago, I think 4 years ago, and then I came up with Ed, who's also in the group today, and we had a look around. And my lasting thought of it is, I think it's a beautiful distillery because it's a proper working distillery that's not built for the public. But what sort of strikes me is when you first walk up or drive up to it, you've got that nice big wall which says Tomintown, and then it says the gentle dram. And when you drink it, it is a nice gentle dram.
Yeah, it's funny. So that came around when Terry was looking at the distillery. So Tomintown, funnily enough, when Terry wanted to buy a distillery, we approached White Mackay because they had a couple that they were looking at shifting back in 2000. And the original distillery he was shown was Tamnavulin. But he didn't want Tamnavulin. And it was actually Robert Fleming. There's nothing wrong with Tamnavulin, by the way. But Robert Fleming, our distillery manager, who now works for us, was in charge of both plants. And he collected Terry from the airport in Inverness, and they took him to Tomintown because that's where Robert was based, to then go to Tamnavulin. And Terry, if you ever get a chance to meet him, did you ever meet him at the whiskey show? He did come along one year.
Well, Robert?
No, Terry. I'm wondering if you got.
I'm not sure if I've met Terry. The only people I've met is Robert, and then there was an oldish chap who showed us around the distillery the first time I went.
Was that Tom?
Tom, that's the one, yeah. But he'd gone the second time we came, and for the life of me, I just can't remember. Can you remember, Ed, this person that showed us around Tomintown when we went?
Graham Bowie, maybe? Or Andy?
Yeah, I can't really remember.
No.
But yes,
he was lovely, whoever he was.
No, they're a lovely team. I think that's the thing that, kind of digressing a little, one of the great things about Tomintown, although we're not a visitor-centered distillery, we don't have a student in a kilt showing you around, but actually the people that show you around make it every day, and they love to kind of talk about it. It's not that we don't want people to visit, we just need to know you're coming so that we can arrange people covering whatever area of the distillery would normally be at Mand.
I think we were there for like 3 hours. It was a wonderfully informative tour.
The highlight for us was the electric kept going off.
Nice.
Oh yes, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, we obviously had to amuse ourselves with whiskey while there was waiting for the electric to come back on.
What things to amuse yourself?
Yeah,
Yeah, the most interesting bit came that the electric came back on just as we had to pay for the whiskey we'd ordered. So it was that was the worst part of the morning.
Yeah, we were in the still room, I think, when the electrics went off. That was pretty amazing for it to kind of be loud and working away, and then suddenly just go like doom.
Well, you can see why we have such big malt stores there. I think that's the thing. Tomintown it's a beautiful distillery, but it is remote, and especially in the winter, it's a bit of a pain. And I think a lot of comments from people that I've shown around is that, wow, you've got a lot of hoppers here. I'm like, yeah, it keeps about 2 weeks worth of production just in case, because things can go wrong, especially when you're a bit remote. It's not that easy to necessarily get your malt delivered. But yeah, so the reason I was saying about Terry is Terry's a really fascinating guy, total salt of the earth individual, and literally built a business by kind of looking at a gap. So he was trading actually in coffee, was his initial business. He was doing espressos before it was hip, and he was selling Italian coffee machines, but he actually that business kind of crumbled because in the 60s there wasn't a demand for it. But he actually, so he kind of saw lots of his customers were looking at blends, and he kind of looked at, well, if people didn't want to buy the big names and they wanted to do their own, how do you do that in a more manageable scale? So that's a lot of what they did, was kind of create that balance. And in terms of Tommenthal, it was really keen for him. He wanted to get a malt distillery, so he went to see. The reason I was asking if you knew him is because if you'd met him, you'd understand where this conversation came from. But effectively, he went to see Tamnavillin, got taken to Tommenthal, said to Robert, "This looks nice. Kind of tell me more about Tommenthal." And they're like, "No, this isn't for sale." And he's like, "No, but tell me more. Like, how does this work? What's your production? Kind of what's your running costs, etc., etc." So Robert kind of chatted with him about it, but it was one of these things that it wasn't on the market. Went to see Tamnavillin, didn't really like it, came back, and then phoned up White Mackay. Was in negotiation to buy Tommenthal, so he managed to buy the distillery that wasn't for sale when he was going to see the other one. So he was really keen to get it. And the reason that Gentle Dram came around is when they eventually got the. I told you I'd come back to the real answer to the question, but when they actually got into having that discussion. And when they bought the distillery and they were looking at the stocks, he was tasting it with a few of his friends and trying some of the spirits. And one of them commented, "Oh yeah, that's lovely. It's a really gentle dram." And that kind of rung with Terry. So that's why this has kind of become part of the tagline.
Yeah.
It is a little bit, I suppose the negative of having it on every bottle is if you create anything that isn't gentle, it's a bit contradictory.
Yeah.
Something we get asked for all the time is cask strength stuff. And yes, I would love to see more cask strength Tommenthal. We do some single casks. But if you do a cask strength and it's kind of big and fiery and kind of punchy in the face sort of stuff, it makes it a bit more difficult to then call it a gentle dram. So that's the only negative of having a tagline like that, but c'est la vie.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm on the 16 at the moment, which I think for the Tommenthal is the perfect age from what I've tried. And I know when we was at the distillery, we tried that, and then we got the Portwood 15 finish, and that is absolutely gorgeous. But you know what always intrigues me is that, like we said, for Tommenthal, it is. I mean, to me, the way you market it, it's a perfect dram to introduce people to whiskey, and I don't mean that in a bad way, as it's not good enough to be higher, but it is the perfect, nice, softer drinking whiskey, but yet people still don't know about it.
Yeah, it's a funny one. It's kind of, because of its flavor style, it's very approachable. And I remember trying my first Tommenthal was a 16-year-old. I'm trying to remember. I can never remember exactly how old I was. It was either 19 or 20. And I'm not going to lie, a big factor in that was the fact that I could almost afford to buy a dram of 16-year-old because it is quite keenly priced. But I think that kind of creamy, soft, and kind of that gentle, I suppose, flavor profile does make it quite a nice dram for people that maybe aren't so keen on whiskey. But at the same time, it's also a nice dram for people that know the whiskey. So Tommenthal 16 is probably the whiskey I drink the most because I think it's a lovely kind of sipping whiskey. It's not something you need to put in a kind of capita and tease all the aromas and flavors out of. It's actually a whiskey that's quite upfront. It's kind of, it wears its heart on its sleeve. It's quite the noses and aroma really tie in with the palate, but you don't have to kind of sit and tease it all out. It's quite upfront in its kind of flavor profile and a nice kind of sipping whiskey in terms of kind of balance. I suppose the thing is we're not a supermarket whiskey, so we only work with independents and kind of whiskey specialists, and I think that's the thing that we'd probably be more popular if we went down this Tesco route. I'm not necessarily singling them out, but I think that would get us better known, but we don't really pitch to that market. But then obviously if you do that, then you have to cross over the other way around, where people who drink whiskey probably will kind of look over it. So we're kind of in that middle ground. So yeah, it's a whiskey that we find that a lot of people who try it love it, but it's getting people to try it is the difficulty to get it known.
Yeah, and I mean, one thing that always struck me when I walked around the distillery was, for, again, sort of harping on about the fact it's not as well known outwards, that I think, are you about 3.3 million litres?
Yeah. So it's 3.3 million litres production. And you would have seen as well, the storage on site is massive. So we have a lot of warehousing there. So we store about 120,000 casks up there. And again, it's kind of deliberate. It's perfect conditions for storing whiskey. But our production, so we're kind of medium scale, I suppose. We didn't expand production, although we've gone into full production. So we're 7 days a week. However, we've never expanded. It was expanded in the 70s. So they put in a second set of stills. But they kind of bought it to be a whiskey that could produce that amount. So yeah, we could probably push it to be more kind of more commercial, I suppose, in terms of our outputs. But we take a lot of pride over it. I think because the blends are so much of our operation. That was from the get-go. As soon as we started, we've always been doing that, and that is kind of our bread and butter, I suppose. Because of that, we take a lot of passion and care over our Tomintoul spirit. So everything we do is hand selected. We don't. I know you see that banded around all the time, but we literally know every single cask. And when we're making our blends, or not our blends, but when we're making our overall products, whether it's 16-year-old, 10-year-old, etc., we do check every batch. So it is hand selected in terms of, I suppose the fun thing about having a blend inside the operation is if you have a kind of barrel that doesn't fit the profile, which you'll all be familiar with, that every whiskey cask is different. And every now and again, the cask you think is going to taste the way it does doesn't. You can use that elsewhere. You can find another use for these if you have a big pile of flavors to play with. So everything is kind of hand coordinated and hand kind of checked. So with that, there's a lot of pride over the spirit. So we don't kind of do the same volume as doing it in a kind of, we're not batting 100 casks at a time. It's usually going to be kind of 20 or 15. But I don't know if that.
Yeah, but I mean, you know, when we look at those figures though, so that's, if we're looking at what you said earlier with 80% going into blending roughly, that's sort of around the 2.3, 2.4 million litres.
Yeah.
Still leaves you 1 million litres for single malt whiskey, which, you know, when you then say, well, we've got 1 million litres for single malt, it actually becomes quite a big distillery in the sense of single malt, when, again, we go back to the thing of, it's not that well known but you're obviously selling 1 million litres somewhere. So, you know, what's the big market then for Tomintoul?
So our biggest markets are the US. Funnily enough, second, I think, is UK still. So UK is still our second biggest market. And then we're looking at kind of Taiwan is quite large as well. Funnily enough, Tomintoul and Old Ballantrae, which I'll come on to later, that's a heavily peated. I don't know if you guys have tried it, I'm sure, but heavily peated Tomintoul is really big in Ukraine. Randomly, over the last few years, but it's really kind of taken off. And we have quite big markets in places like Sweden as well for some of the peated ranges. So it's kind of scattered. It's funny, our SKUs tend to do well in countries. So some random SKUs do really well in certain countries and actually account for a lot of volume.
Yeah.
But the biggest markets are places like UK, US, and over in Asia as well. So
obviously, within that, you've just mentioned your peated side. So how much roughly do you do of peated whiskey then?
So we make peated whiskey for 5 weeks per year. I actually tried to do the sum of this once because I don't know the exact volumes, but it's roughly, so if you're talking about, I think it's about 200 and 250,000 litres equivalent. But a lot of that goes into just the peated releases. We'd use a little bit in blending. But that's a kind of funny random twist of events because they created it to use in blending because obviously if you want to have a peated element to a blend, you would trade with Islay. And Terry decided, why don't we try and make our own back in 2001? And they did it for 1 week and then the same again the year after. And as it's kind of unfolded, it made this really nice spirit that doesn't taste anything like an Islay, but it's really nice. So that's kind of become a new part of the range, and we still trade with Islay for our reciprocal. But so the peated stuff, we probably use much more of that in the actual malt releases. And those brands, Old Ballantrae, which is the heavily peated version, is lesser known, but it's starting to pick up. And Tomintoul Peaty Tang does really well in a couple of markets. So places like, again, Asia, but actually Sweden's the biggest market for that one, which is the kind of medium peated Tomintoul.
So with that then, I mean, the only peated Tomintoul I think that I was shown wasn't under the name of Tomintoul. So
yeah, okay.
Why do you not sell it as Tomintoul? Why is it under a different banner?
I suppose it kind of ties back. So we do two different ones. So there's one which is Tomintoul with the Peaty Tang, which is in a kind of green bottle. I can show you some if you want the next one. I can grab them. But so we do Tomintoul with the Peaty Tang, which is part of the Tomintoul range, but we put it in the green glass because it doesn't taste like Tomintoul. It's kind of a different style. And that one is actually a hybrid of our heavily peated spirit with unpeated Tomintoul, so kind of softens it up a bit. And then we do the full peat range, which is called Old Ballantrae. It's named after our spring. The reason we don't tie it in as much as I would like to for understanding is just that it doesn't really kind of taste like Tomintoul. It's got a very distinctive character. And again, if you're supposed to be tying it back to that gentle dram thing, it doesn't really fit that. So it's 50 ABV, 55 ppm, kind of big, full-on smoky stuff. So we kind of gave it its own brand because it's very distinctive and quite different.
I was going to say, so Christoph, he's trademarked it already, and he's put, why don't you just put the not so gentle draft?
I saw that part. That's actually brilliant. I would like to put that.
I'm sure he'll sell you the trademarking for that one. So where do you get the peat from then? Is that an Aberdeenshire peat?
Yeah, so it's taken from Speyside. So we're getting a peated malt from Crisp HP, so just up in Port Gordon.
So it's the same place as we take our peated malt from as well then.
No, yeah, you guys get used to it as well.
We've got to come up to Scotland for our peated stuff as well. So, sorry, go on.
I was going to say, well, actually, one of the fields is literally on the outskirts of Tomintoul. They've put it into fallow at the moment because they're kind of letting it recover a bit. But there's 3 fields they use in Speyside, and one of them's called Famusak, which literally is on our doorstep. Right. Which is quite cool. But but those guys we source from. They're pretty consistent. And have you been up to Crisp? Have you gone to go and see it?
I've not been up to Crisp yet. Hopefully, as part of the job, I've got an excuse to go now. So
definitely.
It's supposed to be quite a decent day out there.
It's really cool to see, and actually the peating process is really cool to see on a larger scale. I've seen it at like Springbank and some of the kind of smaller distilleries that do it still using kilns, but I mean theirs is quite an impressive operation. And there's literally mountains of peat sitting outside in the kind of outside in the warehouses that they kind of use for the peating. It's pretty cool. Yeah, anyway, I digress. But
and so with Tomintoul then, obviously, like I'm drinking the 16, which I think is just pure bourbon. So we know obviously the 15-year-old you do, and I don't know if you still do it with the 12-year-old, which is both Portwood.
Yeah.
You obviously then do an Oloroso, because I've got a 12-year-old Oloroso here.
Yeah.
So what other casks are you using at the moment?
So in terms of our releases, those are the kind of main 3. I suppose you can include 4 if you do Ruby and Tawny. But yeah, so we use bourbon cask majoritively. The process at Tomintoul and the spirit that comes out is very kind of light and kind of sweet. So it's got a nice kind of creamy and kind of orchard fruit driven style new make is Tomintoul. And I suppose with that, if you stick that into a really heavily flavored cask, you kind of lose it a bit. So Tomintoul really suits bourbon barrels. If you put it straight into a sherry butt, it tastes great, but it tastes like a sherry butt. So what we tend to do, and port and things like that. So what we tend to do is mature in bourbon first and then finish. The bourbon casks just give our spirit some body. It kind of amplifies that creamy character that's already there. You get that lovely kind of vanilla through it. So we tend to do bourbon for kind of 95% of our maturation or filling anyway, and then we'll use other casks to finish. So our main releases, we have sherry and port. We've also got some really cool Pedro Jimenez line down at the moment. One of the fun things, I suppose, about my appointment to the blending side is I've been in charge of cask procurement for our kind of exotic casks. With Angus and Lee, that counts as anything other than bourbon and Oloroso. So I've got some pretty cool stuff which we've had lined down for a year and a bit now. So we've got Sauterne, we've got Moscatel, we've got Tokai, we've got PX, various other bits and pieces. So watch this space. There's a cool new release. It's not quite ready yet, but it'll be due out at the beginning of next year. I can't tell you what that is yet, unfortunately, but yeah, so it's one of these things. Tomintoul, like I say, we're kind of in this interesting transition that we're kind of catching up with some of the other people in the industry, because they've kind of played it safe in terms of they've created what people know and they've created what we're good at, but they've not taken many risks. And I think that's the thing, that because we have the other side of the business, which kind of accounts for a lot of our turnover, they've been relatively risk adverse. So if they've created a cast that they're not really sure of, they've not released it, rather than just sending it out and seeing what people think. They've been kind of like, that didn't really end up how we wanted it to be, so we'll kind of put it to one side. Whereas now they're kind of starting to play around a bit more. So we are starting to kind of, I mean, don't get me wrong, they're good spirits. When I'm saying playing around, it makes it sound like it could be anything. But yeah, so we're kind of starting to do more with that. And again, it's not anything new in the whiskey industry terms. It's not like we're trying to break boundaries. Wow, he's using a Sauterne cask. But it's it's something that we're working on. So it's kind of, there's new things in the pipeline that will be out soon, and you'll start to see fruits of that in the next kind of 6 months, hopefully.
I mean, the one that interests me within that list is the Sauternes cask, because I do see that working very well with your spirit, with the gentleness of it, and it just giving it that nice sweetness. So, I mean, how are they coming along? They must be
Really good.
exciting.
I have a sample kicking about next door, actually. No,
You keep telling us that. That's not much good to us.
I don't know if I can send you a snippet before it's ready. I would offer to, but I need to check if it's actually allowed. No, I think that we were kind of careful with the casks that we've been using, so we tried to make it marry with the flavor profile, the spirit. Since I've joined the company, I've been harping on about doing Glencadam and Calvados, and that's the reason for that is I think Glencadam Spirit would be brilliant in that cask type. Recently, it's been legalized, which is good, but at the time it wasn't. So we're looking to try and get some of them. And Tom and Tell, yeah, the kind of casks that I've really picked out for thinking it'll do well in are Sauterne. White Port was one I was really keen to put it into as well. And again, Tokai I think could be fun, but we're kind of waiting to see how that turns out. Also, kind of lighter wine casks, so things like a Chardonnay cask would be good for it, I think.
Yeah.
But you don't want to kind of overpower it. I think it's a difficult one. Like Tom and Tell and sherry works well because of the creaminess, but if you put it into anything too kind of syrupy, it can be a bit iffy. So,
yeah. Have you looked at Fino with yours? Because I would have thought that would work quite well.
I would love to get some Fino and some Manzanilla. I've not managed to convince them on that one yet. That's something I'm working on. I've got a really good source. I mean, again, we can go on about sherry casks later on, but I'm a big fan of sherry, and I managed to get some proper sherry casks for both brands from a supplier I used to work with in the wine industry. So these are kind of 25-year-old kind of PX matured sherry butts and some 20-year-old Oloroso. So actual sherry butts rather than reciprocals, or not reciprocals, but kind of filled casks. So we've got some really cool stuff coming down the line. I couldn't get any Fino off of them, but I'd really like to get some Fino and some Palicatado and some Manzanilla. But
with the spirit sort of being more of a kind of gentle, lighter profile, how does it stand up to sherry?
It does well if you season it first. So what we tend to do is put it into the bourbon first, just to give it some body. In sherry on its own, it's good, but you find it gets a little bit lost. So I think that much about them having kind of a single malt in a cocktail or anything like that, I think that it's important when you're trying your drink to know that it's what you're where you're getting it from. And I think the distilleries taste unique, and that's the fun thing with distilleries. So if you take a Tom and Tell and you shove it straight in a PX butt and open it in 15 years, it'll taste good, but it won't necessarily taste, you wouldn't be able to say, oh yeah, that's a Tom and Tell. So we tend to do the bourbon first to give it a bit more formidable kind of character to then hold up to the strong finishes. And that's still what we're doing. So even these new casks we're talking about, none of these, well, I think there's one type that we've tried some new fill, but most of it is actually finishing because we wanted to give it some body before putting it in these cask types. But it's a good question. I think that it's always important to know your limits, and I think Angus Dundee are quite good at that in terms of they don't, like I said about being risk adverse, they don't start sticking the spirit in stuff that probably won't work. So instead of thinking we'll try it and see what happens, they'll just say, well, I don't think it's going to work, so we'll do something.
You're not just jumping on the bandwagon, you are actually thinking about how that will work with the spirit, which is really important.
So it's kind of do justice to the spirit. I mean, obviously getting people to drink it more would be the main thing we could do to get it justice, but it is one of these things. I think they do try to make sure that they're kind of happy with everything they put out.
Well, I'm sure if you ask for volunteers, there'll be quite a few on here that'll say they'll come and try it.
Well, totally. Like I said, if I could figure out a way of getting you guys some of the new casks, leave it with me. I'll see what I can do. Because
you don't have to send a full cask.
I don't.
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, we're not going to complain at a full cask, just to let it know. And you have said this on live recording, just to let you know.
I'm aware. Yeah. Well, I need to check and see. I mean, if there was a way, I would love to see if we can share some of the stuff that we're laying down to show you what's coming up, to get some feedback too.
Yeah. I mean, that might come into what we discussed anyway with another session. Obviously, the group doesn't know about that at the moment, but